Bel Air football coach John Magistro might have said it best in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, quote, "Every town once in a while, I guess, has something bizarre happen, but nothing like this. This is about as bizarre as it gets." He was referring to the story of Nathan Brooks in Bel Air, Ohio. This sleepy small town is situated just across the Ohio River from the large town of Wheeling, West Virginia. While Wheeling had its share of crime, Bel Air was relatively quiet. Its nearly 4,000 residents were close with their neighbors and secure in the feeling that they lived in a safe place. Pat Barotti told the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, quote, "I've lived here my whole life, and I can't think of anything as bad as this. I'm not saying we've never had any crime, but we've never had anything this gruesome." The subject of our story, Nathan Brooks, was born to Terry and Marilyn Brooks in 1978. The second son after his brother Jamie. The youngest, Ryan, would follow a year later. The Brooks family lived on Margie Avenue in a somewhat secluded house with the neighbors far enough away to give them privacy, but close enough to see some of their less flattering behavior. There were some rumors that Terry had anger and drinking problems, with a quote from Nathan's public attorney, Jim Nicholson, reading, quote, "What appeared to have been a normal, loving family had a dark side. The reality is that Nathan Brooks's father was an alcoholic, and when he was drinking, he literally turned from what was described as a nice person to a, quote, mean, abusive SOB. Their mother, Marilyn, favored and doted upon Nathan, while their father, Terry, had a clear preference for Ryan. Marilyn's sister, Marlis Smith, corroborated the rumors that Terry Brooks was an alcoholic. Marlis had moved away from her sister 10 years prior and said she and her sister had not spoken in the last 3 years due to Terry's dislike of her. She said that even before that, it was difficult for Marilyn to speak to her, because Terry could be very controlling over his wife. She said, quote, "Terry was very, very abusive. He was a possessive person. He used to beat Marilyn up all the time." When Marlis had moved away, she remembered Jamie being a small, fearful child, but said Marilyn didn't try to do much to stop the abuse, because she didn't want anyone to know about it and thought that Terry could change. She went on to say, quote, "Nathan got the worst of it. Nathan was a very sweet, gentle, happy little kid. Terry did not bother him until he was 2 or 3. She said Terry would call him names in an attempt to, quote, toughen him up and make a man out of him. In fact, if Nathan so much as cried, Terry would get angry with him. She said, quote, when he was about 3, we noticed that when Nathan would be playing, he was quiet, and all of a sudden he would be staring off. Something would come over his face. Something bad. You could see it." The town's opinion of Nathan and his family was generally positive. Debbie Koski, Nathan's neighbor, told the Gazette, quote, "Nathan seemed like a normal kid, a little quiet, a little shy, but well-mannered and friendly. We can't believe he would be capable of something like this." Hi, I'm your host, Zach Williams. Welcome to Compulsion. Growing up, Nathan was heavily involved in his church, at one point serving as an altar boy to Reverend George Yonts, and considering going into the priesthood himself. Reverend Yonts had trusted the boy and earned his trust in return. Nathan had a profound interest in not just Christianity, but other religions as well, and being an avid reader, he had read up on the Bible, the Quran, and other religious texts. During Nathan's religious phase, 2 of his friends passed away in the same year. One committed suicide. The other passed away from a brain tumor that was the result of an assault incident. He said that attending the funeral for his friend was the first time he realized that he was different from other people. Everybody seemed to be very sad, but all Nathan could think about was, quote, what would happen to the body parts. he didn't feel any strong emotions at the passing of his friend. After this, Nathan's interests became darker. He started listening to heavy metal and getting involved in the occult. Included in his collection were the Egyptian spell book, the Book of the Dead, Anton LaVey's The Satanic Rituals, books on Jeffrey Dahmer and Jack the Ripper, as well as Whoever Fights Monsters, a book about an FBI profiler's interviews during the formation of the Behavioral Analysis Unit. Also, as sometimes happens with teenagers in small towns, Nathan was known for dabbling in hallucinogenic drugs. Eventually, he started visiting an abandoned house to perform satanic rituals. He would cover the walls with satanic symbols and attempt to commune with Satan. This ended when the woman who owned the house chased him away, adding trespassing and vandalism to Nathan's existing record of petty crimes. Nathan's darker interests only worsened after his visit to Columbus to stay with his older brother Jamie at The Ohio State University. That summer, Nathan worked in a nursing home and would often seek out the patients who were dying because he was interested in observing the process. While there, Jamie reported finding bones that Nathan had collected, and sometimes suspected Nathan of mutilating the local cats, cutting off bits of their ears or tails. At one point, Jamie's wife found a lamb's skull in the room Nathan was staying in, along with literature of the occult. Nathan had apparently stolen the lamb from the agricultural department and sacrificed it, keeping the skull as a souvenir. Jamie did express concern about Nathan's behavior, but Nathan assured him it was just a phase. While in Columbus, Nathan befriended two self-proclaimed Wiccan witches, who accepted and encouraged his hobbies. They agreed with him that he was evil, and would listen to him describe his dark thoughts. One day, while working at the nursing home, Nathan spontaneously decided that it was time to act on his urges and kill someone. He picked out a man walking past the facility and had a knife out, ready to surprise him, but stopped when a car drove past. According to psychologist John Mason, quote, he got a great deal of glee out of it, because he was going to do something to this man and he had no idea about it. Family friend Eric Baratti would later remark that Nathan was very different when he came back from OSU. Starting around the time of his junior year, Nathan began drawing satanic symbols on his schoolwork and writing phrases such as God is dead, Satan is good. He would even sometimes sign his school papers, Nathan Brooks, Master of Death. Nathan was referred to his school counselor, Amy Farmer, for his troubles. She said that he was very nice, but at one point, when she was in a classroom with Nathan and several other students, he threatened to cut off her head and dump her body by the side of the road. He also told her during private conversations that he was smoking marijuana, using homemade LSD, and huffing up to 2 cans of butane a day. He said the butane helped free him from his obsessive thoughts. Farmer called Marilyn to tell her about Nathan's troubles, but Marilyn said it was just a phase he was going through. John Mason would later describe Nathan as a very intelligent person who was aware of his, quote, potential for evil acts. In the last week of September in 1995, Nathan had been acting strangely, ignoring classmates when they said hi to him in the halls. Eric Baratti told the Dispatch that Nathan was a smart kid, and people should have paid more attention to his increasingly erratic behavior. The past year, and especially the past week, had been clear signs of Nathan's burgeoning mental illness. Nathan's former babysitter, Carol Stasky, would later say that as Nathan grew up, she saw him go from a happy child to, quote, sullen and withdrawn due to Terry's abuse. In late September, he showed up at her front door, saying that he wanted to tell Carol that he loved her. He was very thin and fidgeting constantly. But when she asked him what was wrong, he just told her not to worry. Carol told Marilyn about what happened, but Marilyn didn't seem concerned. Just days later, on September 30th, 1995, Marilyn had just returned from a work conference in Florida and was looking forward to relaxing at home. Ryan, Nathan's brother, had had spent the day with his best friend and teammate, Eric Barati, at a local football game. That night, after his parents were asleep, Nathan snuck up on Terry while he was resting and shot him in the head 3 times. He then struck Marilyn in the back of the head with an axe. He decapitated Terry and stabbed Marilyn over 10 times in the abdomen. He would later describe the murders in a taped confession, a confession that was already inconsistent with the times of death, though it was given that night. He said, quote, "I went into Mom's room, and I murdered her. It wasn't like my mom, like the woman I loved. It was like skin, like an animal, like a dog." He then went on to say, quote, "And then I murdered my dad, and I took a walk. At one point during the murders, Nathan paused in front of a mirror and cut himself, finding that he was disassociating from what was happening. After cutting off his father's head, he placed it in a large bowl atop an altar in his room. Inside the bowl was a rubber mask with a hole in it to symbolize the bullet hole in his father's head. He said he needed it for a ritual to increase his power. He then said, quote, "Then I performed a black mass. I was deciding something, if I should kill more people. I decided not to." Then he went on to discuss his relationship with Satan, claiming that he felt love from Satan after he murdered his parents, saying, quote, "It's just like you talk to the Lord. Sometimes he answers back." At the foot of Marilyn's bed, they found nails and a hammer, as Nathan had been planning to crucify her. The knife recovered from her abdomen would later be shown in court. Around 1:45 a.m., Ryan was still at Eric's house, unaware of what had happened to his parents. He decided he wanted to spend the night at Eric's house, so he called home to ask if that was okay. Nathan answered and told Ryan that no, his parents wanted him home that night. Nathan would later say, quote, "I didn't want him to see what I did. I wanted him to be with my mom and my dad. I was going to kill him with my mom and dad." Ryan finished hanging out and Eric drove him home around 2:45 a.m. On the way there, one report claims they happened to see Ryan's mother's car on the road and assumed she had driven towards Eric's home to fetch her son. Instead, Nathan showed up at the Baratis and woke up Pat, Eric's mother, asking for Ryan. Pat shooed Nathan away, saying they were already headed home. When Ryan and Eric made it back to the house, they noticed all of the lights were on, which Ryan found odd since his father worked the next day, but Eric left him to settle in. Ryan walked into his house alone to find the gruesome scene. By the time Eric got home, he had a missed call and a frantic voicemail from Ryan, telling him that someone had murdered his parents. Eric woke his father, Dennis. They were skeptical of Ryan's statements, but went to his house anyway. When they arrived, they quickly realized that Eric was serious, and it wasn't some kind of bizarre prank or morbid joke. Dennis took Ryan and Eric to a nearby fire station and called for help. One report claims that they called to wake up Pat to warn her to leave their home, as Nathan had not yet been found. Sure enough, after she left, they saw Nathan enter the Barati home and leave shortly after, wearing Eric's clothes. When authorities finally caught up with him at 3:33 a.m., he was at nearby Winding Hill Cemetery. Nathan told one of the arresting officers, quote, "Did my brother see them? I know I made a mistake. I shouldn't have done it." When the Baratis decided it was safe to return, they found a note stabbed into the wall with a steak knife, along with an envelope full of money. It was addressed to Ryan and read, quote, "To Ryan, hey, this is Nathan. I murdered 2 people, and I'm going to turn myself in. I left some money for you. P.S. If Eric or his dad steals this money, I swear I'll come back and fuck them up. Love, Nathan." The exact timeline of events that night is a bit difficult to substantiate, but we focused on local sources that were written immediately after the fact to put together the most accurate timeline possible. That being said, there are a few inconsistencies. Papers that had primary reporters in Bel Air just days later would all conflict with each other. The note definitely exists, so at some point in the night, Nathan did visit the Barati household, but it was possibly left stabbed on the front door rather than inside the house, as it doesn't make much sense that he would go back into the house twice given the timeline. It's also possible he was apprehended at the cemetery, but the Times leader claims it was at a residence, so possibly the Barati household or the house Nathan would conduct rituals in. These inconsistencies would only grow as the case went on, causing rumors and confusion that would inundate the town for the months and years ahead. After he was arrested, Nathan would give Sheriff McCourt a detailed 35-minute-long confession. Local papers at one point said Nathan was alone in the room, but during the trial clarified that both Jamie and a social worker had been present. Nathan went on to talk about how he'd been full of hate and anger since he was young, and after the killings he felt better. When asked what caused his inner turmoil and anger, he said, quote, "Everything, but not my mom." He said he had tried to stop his urges, but he couldn't do it on his own, and still felt a desire to kill. Quote, "I need help. It keeps coming. Even now, everybody in this room." Brooks went on to say that he didn't think that Satanism was to blame or the books he'd been reading, and said, quote, "I thought I could control it. I don't want to blame my actions on that. It was my fault. I need to be punished." Along with the note left at the Barati household, authorities found a list of names on Nathan's desk. Among a list of several names were Ryan and George Yonts. Though not on this list, Nathan would later tell authorities he had planned to cut his father in half, but just hadn't got around to it. The supposed list would be the subject of plenty of controversy and rumor. In 2015, former reporter and journalist Steve Novotny would do a deep dive into the case on the Wheeling news site Wheelunk. He claims that he received permission from local authorities to view the list, which in fact only contained 13 names. Supposedly next to Ryan's name were the words, quote, "dismember and decapitate." Next to some of the other names, he had penciled in his plans to, quote, "skin, molest, or eviscerate." This is the only source making these claims and conflicts with what was said in the Times Leader in 1995 to 1996. However, it's possible this information was simply too graphic to publish at the time. Terry and Marilyn's bodies were quickly shipped off to Columbus for examination by forensic experts at The Ohio State University, as the town was not prepared to deal with a crime of this caliber. On October 1st, the Times Leader was the only paper to cover the story the day after it happened, and it would continue to be the most detailed and reliable source throughout the course of the case. Sheriff McCourt told reporters in this article that, quote, "He said he tried to talk to people. He is a very intelligent young man and very well read. There's a thin line between madness and genius." The article continued to say that Nathan had planned to visit his priest the next day and had additional plans for his murder spree, but that he couldn't go into detail. McCourt also stressed that some of what the neighbors had told the media was not true. On October 2nd, the Times Leader, the Intelligencer, and the Wheeling News Register would all run stories about the murders. This is where reports started to conflict with one another, and small details reported incorrectly will be parroted by national newspapers. The trial held that morning was the first in a series of preliminary hearings that would determine whether or not the 17-year-old could be tried as an adult and have his case transferred to the adult court system. A gag order imposed by Judge John J. Malik, Jr. banned the press from attending, and reporters from nearby cities were left waiting at the gates while Nathan was taken out the back of the courthouse to Sargis Juvenile Center, where he was being held. Before the gag order had been placed, however, Bel Air Police Chief Bob Wallace attempted to quell the fears of the public. He said that the rumors that law enforcement knew of the murders before they were going to happen was untrue, and that there was absolutely not a 40-person hit list. He confirmed that Nathan had a list of some kind, but that there were nowhere near 40 names, and he was absolutely not calling it a hit list. He also said authorities had determined there was no one else involved. The rumors that there was a coven of Satan worshippers had the town terrified, and he even went so far as to say Nathan himself said he had acted alone. The News Register mentioned the house that Nathan held his rituals in, Inside the house, they found a pentagram, which is a 5-pointed star, and the word Lucifer. McCourt said that he and Nathan discussed his interest in the occult at length, and told reporters, quote, "He said he had been interested in the occult all his life. I'm not saying he's insane, but he's a sick puppy." McCourt also attempted to stop the rumors that Nathan had a cult following. Nathan told McCourt that usually when he told people about his interests, they would think it was, quote, goofy, except for the 2 girls he had met in Columbus. This newspaper was also the first source of the alleged, quote, "I'll be famous by Monday." This would later be repeated in many other sources, saying that Nathan supposedly told classmates that the day of the murders. The source of this quote is vague. The Wheeling Intelligencer ran the article on the Brooks case under the headline, quote, "Teen Planned Murder Spree," says Sheriff. The 3rd paragraph in the article says, quote, "The boy reportedly planned to undertake at least 30 murders, and said that if he was unable to finish the task, members of his cult would." No specific name is given for this quote, just officials, and it directly conflicts with what Sheriff McCourt and Bob Wallace said. This article also mentioned that there were satanic symbols in the residence, which other papers clarified was not the Brooks house, but this paper left vague, starting a rumor that symbols had been painted on the walls of the Brooks home. There was no mention made of the fact that McCourt specifically said that the list was not a hit list, despite the fact that all 3 newspapers in the immediate areas attended the same press conference and had many of the same quotes. All 3 papers corroborated that Nathan had been apprehended at 3:33 a.m., though the Times leader said, quote, "at a residence," while the other papers mentioned the cemetery. All the papers mentioned that Terry was a postal worker who was dedicated to his job, and Marilyn was a pension clerk and loving mother who was proud of her boys. Meanwhile, at Bel Air High, over a dozen students sought counseling that Monday, and the school offered its support to any nearby high schools should they have any need of their resources. Though the preliminary hearing itself could not be discussed, the conditions needed to have Nathan tried as an adult were explored in the Times Leader article. According to state law, any child over the age of 15 who had committed a felony act and was deemed to be beyond rehabilitation and an active danger to the public could be tried as an adult. The next day, on October 3rd, all 3 papers would jump at the chance to cover updates on the story. The Times Leader had updates on the Brooks case on the front page, right under continuing updates on the O.J. Simpson trial. Diana Moody, a girl from Brooks' class who had known him since middle school, said, quote, "I've heard some people say that he was a maniac or crazy, but he wasn't. He could kid around with you, and if you needed someone to talk to, he was always willing to listen." She claimed that she had never seen him do any drugs and hadn't heard his remark that he would be famous by Monday. Barbara Morgan, Marilyn's sister, flew in from Dallas after hearing about the murders. She said, quote, "It shocked me. It feels like I'm in a movie and nothing is real." The News Register ran a piece that discussed how the motion to lift the gag order was denied. The motion had been filed by the Times Leader, the Intelligencer, and the News Register working together. Judge Malik said, quote, "The child is still a child, even though he has been accused of 2 heinous crimes." Though the judge did relent and allow photographs, as he agreed he couldn't ban photographs that hadn't been taken yet. From this point on, many of the articles covering the case would be accompanied by photos of Nathan being escorted to the court with a cloth covering his head. A neighbor, who chose to remain anonymous, talked about the Brooks boys growing up playing with her kids. She said that they would have sleepovers and play together in the yard, though she did say that when Nathan got older, something about him seemed off. She said, quote, "I hope Ryan and Jamie can get on with some kind of normal life." The article went on to interview several classmates, many of whom described him as nice, if somewhat quiet, and he had been withdrawn last year. One student said, quote, "I don't think you need to make a big deal about it. I mean, it is a big deal, but you're giving him the attention he wants." There were plenty of red flags mentioned in various articles. One article cited Eric Barati himself as the source for Nathan's alleged statement that he would be famous by Monday. Supposedly, the Friday morning before the murders, One of Nathan's friends told fellow student Cliff Rector that they thought Nathan was planning on killing his parents and brother, and he responded with, quote, "Yeah, right." Fellow classmate Andrew Malinek told the Cleveland Plain Dealer that he had heard Nathan talk about killing his parents before, but said, quote, "No one really took him seriously when he said that. He said it like it was a joke." An unnamed classmate and close friend said that Nathan seemed normal, and she was shocked that he was capable of what he did. She said he was jealous of his brother and had fights with his parents, but those were issues that many high schoolers dealt with. Terry's boss at the post office, Debbie Ruffner, recalled how Terry would request off to attend Ryan's football games, and how Ryan would sometimes visit him at the post office. She talked about how Terry loved to sail and had property near Seneca Lake. In the few months before his murder, he had finally taught Marilyn how to sail, after convincing her there was nothing to be afraid of. He was just 4 years away from retirement, and many of his neighbors said he had been living his dreams. The Intelligencer article more or less repeated what the other papers said, but finally included the quote from Sheriff McCourt, saying that the list of names was not a hit list. They said they were debunking that rumor, but neglected to mention that the Intelligencer had been responsible for starting that rumor in the first place. On October 4th, the Times leader ran a page discussing whether or not Nathan should be permitted to attend his parents' funeral. Sergeant Bart Geisey said that the consensus seemed to be that Nathan wouldn't attend, but if that changed, they would have extremely high security. If he were permitted to attend, it would be with 4 armed deputies at a time when nobody else was there, and he likely wouldn't be permitted to see his brothers. Bob Wallace chimed in to remind the media to have respect for the families during the service, saying that television cameras and the like would be intrusive. That same day, Reverend George Yonts visited Nathan in jail. Yonts told the Columbus Dispatch that Nathan seemed remorseful and said, quote, "He was most gracious and pleased that I'd come. I know he's hurt. He has to live with that for the rest of his life. I don't really think we ought to judge Nathan. There has been a struggle from the time of creation between good and bad. Most of us human beings find bad things easier to do than the good things. I think he was just led into being influenced by these counter forces." On October 5th, a memorial service was held for Terry and Marilyn at St. John's Catholic Church. Reverend Yonts led the ceremony to over 100 loved ones. Then the bodies were laid to rest in Davis Cemetery. He asked the town to keep Jamie and Ryan in their thoughts, but did not mention Nathan. It was a rainy day, and Nathan was not permitted to visit the cemetery or graves in any way. Yonts later told reporters for the Times leader that, quote, "To me, Nathan was always generous, gentlemanly, quiet, and pleasant. These murders show the complexity of the human structure." He said that Nathan was a bright boy, and although he was a bit of a loner, that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. He even said that Nathan may have been too smart for his own good, saying, quote, "I have been told that God gave 2 curses to mankind, looks and brains. There's a fine line between genius and insanity." Yonts also remarked that the eldest brother, Jamie, was interested in keeping some kind of relationship with Nathan and helping him to become a better person. A Times Leader article published on October 6th detailed how 2 of Nathan's classmates were found in a cemetery after dark. There was a grave nearby that had been partially dug up with a flag placed nearby, but it looked to have been disturbed prior to that evening. Sheriff McCourt said the teens were just walking and talking, though they weren't supposed to be at the cemetery after dark. This article did little to stop the rumors going around town about satanic cult worshippers digging up graves, and to this day, that rumor persists. On October 6th, in the early morning, the local fire department had been called to the abandoned house where Nathan conducted his rituals. The building burned to the ground. That same afternoon, Judge Malik ruled that there was just cause to try Nathan John Brooks for the murder of his parents. That same day, someone broke into the Brooks household. Details about this break-in wouldn't make the papers until later. On October 8th, at approximately 1:30 a.m., a fire broke out at the Brooks home. The fire department managed to contain it to the porch, and Sheriff McCourt said it was probably set as a prank. Upon closer inspection, they found it had been started in the yard, with a trail of gasoline leading up to a pile of rags on the porch. In addition to the fire in the Brooks home, there had been several bomb threats called into local schools. In an October 8th article, Police Chief Bob Wallace once again tried to placate the public and keep them informed despite the gag order. He said he was taking the idea that there could be more people involved seriously, but did not think it was a serious concern, though he did mention that he was looking closely at other possible occult activity in the area for the past few decades, and did find some indication of it existing previously. The same paper ran an article interviewing an expert on the occult, who largely speculated based on information available before the gag order, and said that violence among teens involving the occult was likely increasing because society itself was becoming more violent. He said there was, quote, death of rationalism in society. Meanwhile, Terry's former employers, as well as post offices nearby, band together to collect a college fund for Ryan. They said they wanted to make sure that he wasn't forgotten and could get an education despite the fact that his support network was very limited. On the 9th, Sheriff McCourt said that there was no evidence of a break-in at the Brooks household, unfortunately showing that McCourt was not above lying to the public to try and stop the hysteria. This information comes from the Times-Leader, but the article they ran the next day on the 10th detailed a disturbing break-in on the 6th before the fire, and was sourced largely from neighbors, conversations overheard on the police scanner, and an unnamed source who claimed to be close with law enforcement. They detailed how, the day before the fire, someone had broken in, and officers on the scene described a possible new sacrifice in the house. They found a new altar had been set up with a chalice placed on top, as well as tapes about satanic rituals, a blue candle that had been melted down, and a shell casing from a .22. There was also a list in the trash can found inside the homes, and on several of these items was what appeared to be blood splatter. The perpetrators had broken in through a basement window and seemingly left all of these items to be discovered, including an elaborate medallion with tiny skulls. The nearby shed had one of its doors ripped off and fresh dirt on two of the shovels. The often quoted Debbie Koski said that at night, people were still afraid in the neighborhood, especially in light of all of the attention the Brooks house had been getting. Other neighbors described seeing 4 people in hoods go in and out of the house before the police were called. That same day, the Times-Leader covered the recent bomb threats. One had been called specifically about the upcoming football game, and authorities and firemen spent hours inspecting the stadium the game was to be held in, as well as the buses taking the team there. They sent officers to patrol during the game and kept everyone feeling safe while they watched for trouble. Though once again authorities stressed that there was no reason to take these threats seriously. On October 10th, the News Register ran a piece about the residents of Bel Air being upset about the gag order. Police Chief Bob Wallace said, quote, Bel Air is made up of God-fearing, hard-working, tax-paying people who won't easily get upset by talk such as this. But the sheer amount of rumor and innuendo has caused an increase in the amount of fear in the churches, schools, and workplaces. The next day, Detective Fred Thompson spoke to the Times-Leader and confirmed that many of the items found were real and not just rumors. He said he would keep patrolling near the house and told the public he didn't have much new information, but wanted to assure them that he didn't think the people were involved with Nathan or dangerous. This article also mentioned 3 people messing around at the Brooks house once again, but nothing was found. Prosecutor John Pilatus expressed his desire to catch those responsible, saying, quote, People forget that the Brooks family has 2 other children. What makes anyone want to vandalize a house that is going to be a monetary asset for the true victims of this crime? On October 12th, the News Register ran a piece following the formal motion to have Brooks tried as an adult. Bob Wallace once again tried to calm the fears of the townspeople, saying that the sudden rise in gun purchases by people who may not know how to use them was a recipe for disaster. He also emphasized that the fires weren't the result of any cult activity, but could have been from a citizen who was tired of looking at the buildings that reminded them of the murders. He went on to talk about the safety of teens in Bel Air, saying, quote, "A lot of parents out there have no idea what their children are doing. They don't know where they go or who they're with. Kids are out there drinking and doing drugs and driving on back roads at 90 miles an hour. Now parents are worried about their safety because of these murders. It's hypocritical." That same day, a group of around 150 citizens gathered at the fire station to talk to local authorities about their concerns. The media was barred, but Fred Thompson spoke to the Times leader afterwards and said the meeting was, quote, "largely a sheriff bashing session. Most of the questions people had couldn't be answered due to the gag order, and many citizens left just as frustrated as before." One unidentified parent expressed their frustration during the week when bomb threats were being called in, saying, quote, "My kids talk about it. They're scared of their friends. They don't trust anyone. It's hard because Nathan was well-liked and trusted. The kids ate lunch with him. The gag order may protect Nathan, but it's causing a lot of fear in our kids." The other mothers of boys on the football team joined in with the postal employees and started gathering money at the games to put towards Ryan's college fund. On October 15th, the Columbus Dispatch ran an article discussing the impact the killings would have on Halloween for the town of Bel Air. Local pastor Mick Foster said, quote, "We've got teenagers sleeping with their parents, adults who won't go out after dark, and parents who never leave their children. Pastors are being called to visit folks they don't even see in church. People have guns out and they're loaded. I've never seen fear overcome a community like this." Mayor Tino Esposito recommended that trick-or-treat not go on as planned, but reassured the local kids that he wouldn't arrest them for going door to door if they still wanted to. Instead, the local PTA and the Bel Air Clergy Association held a Halloween party at a local park. They stressed that it wouldn't be a religious event, just a safe space with adult supervision where the kids could have a parade and get candy. Local clergy members were concerned about the darker implications of Halloween and suggested that the children could dress up as Bible characters rather than as ghosts or vampires. Reverend Joe Byrne, much like Yonce, attempted to be somewhat understanding, saying, quote, "This isn't about an evil boy, but a boy who just got into something evil. That, along with a combination of other things, and seeking power that is not part of God, will kill you or cause you to kill someone else." He went on to say, quote, "Halloween may not be evil enough on the surface, but there is nothing innocent about it. It is very serious." Of course, the proximity to Halloween had many people worried that more pranks or even gruesome crimes might follow, but Halloween in 1995 passed without incident. The officers of the Belmont County Police Department put in countless hours of unpaid overtime to patrol the streets and make everyone feel safe. Kids got to dress up and bob for apples, and the Boo at the Park event was such a success that it continues to this day in Bel Air. While the town of Bel Air struggled to move past the tragedy, Nathan faced being a 17-year-old stuck in the turmoil of the legal system. Was he a killer who needed to be locked away for the rest of his life to protect those around him? Was he so wrapped up in the occult that Satan or other evil forces had taken hold of him? Or was he so young and mentally ill that he had no chance to understand what he was doing, let alone the consequences of his actions? On January 26, 1996, the trial started moving forward, with Nathan formally entering a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. Although Nathan would be tried as an adult, state law still barred a juvenile from being executed. The press was allowed back in court, and the trial was pushed back to allow for enough time for both sides to examine Brooks and decide if he was sane at the time of the murders. The Times leader also mentioned that Brooks was allowed to visit his parents' graves and have his brothers visit him in jail. On September 30th, exactly 1 year after the murders, Nathan Brooks, now 18, appeared in court to try and suppress the 35-minute-long confession he'd given the night of the murders. His older brother testified on his behalf, but was removed from the courtroom during the hearing. Jamie recalled getting a call from Nathan at 4:30 a.m. on the night of the murders and waking his wife up to drive out to Bel Air with him. Jamie said, quote, "I was in shock, and I assume he was too. He was not the same person. His speech was slurred. He was groggy. He wouldn't really look me in the eyes. He was rambling on." Jamie also pointed out that he hadn't tried to get an attorney for Nathan and felt that it was his responsibility. Eventually, Judge Knapp ruled that the confession was given voluntarily, and he would not suppress the contents of it during the trial. When the tape was eventually played for the trial, the crowd was shocked when Nathan laughed while describing how blood sprayed on his shoes after shooting his father in the head. Details about the confession had been released before, but this was the first time the papers confirmed that Nathan did indeed have elaborate plans for a murder spree. He said he would have gone after, quote, "all of the people who trusted me. It would have been so easy." Hearing that same confession played in court, Nathan cried. On October 14th, the Times leader discussed jury and witness selection. Pierce had 23 witnesses lined up, while Nicholson had just 5. 75 potential jurors were summoned, with many of those expected to be dismissed. The final jury would consist of just 12 people. Nathan's public defender needed to prove that Nathan was legally insane at the time of the murders to form an insanity defense. But in doing so, he also portrayed Nathan as someone beyond rehabilitation. Often his arguments are difficult to distinguish from the prosecution. When discussing how Nathan's family and others ignored the warning signs, he said that Nathan would intimidate and threaten them. During Nicholson's opening statement, he said, quote, "For whatever reason, until the fateful day in late September 1995, nothing happened to stop the downward spiral Nathan was in." He went on to say that there were numerous times when someone could have intervened and tried to get Nathan help, but nobody did. Nicholson went on to say, quote, "Nathan could not appreciate the wrongfulness of his acts, and that he would have done anything to make Satan happy. The young man had an extreme mental disturbance. He still does, and although medicated, he will be said to be very dangerous." On October 17th, Jim Nicholson focused on Nathan's abusive childhood, saying that Terry began beating him at the age of 3, quote, "because he was too soft." Jamie Brooks said that his father was an alcoholic, would sometimes strike his wife, and bullied his 3 sons. But Jamie did not agree with the label of wife beater. Belmont County Children's Services said that there were only 2 reported incidents of abuse when Nathan was 6, and neither report was deemed worthy of following up. Police Sergeant John Calhoun used to live next door to the Brooks residence, and testified that he had often seen Terry drunk on payday, and described him as a nuisance. Dr. John Mason presented a disturbing picture of Nathan Brooks' mental health. Mason was a Columbus-based psychologist who was no stranger to the courtroom or high-profile cases. He was absolutely not shy of the reporters, and one article painted him as sort of a celebrity psychologist. He confirmed that there were several hit lists, which had probably caused some confusion. On all 4 of the lists, Ryan, Marilyn, and Terry were the first names. Mason said the only reason Ryan was still alive was because of Nathan's obsessive tendencies, and staying out for the night threw his entire plan off course. In court, Mason said, quote, "He told me his first memory was of seeing his father hit his mother. He said he always felt a compulsion to kill, going back as far as to when he was 5 years old. He sees himself as violent, a loner, and not part of mainstream life. He said he is constantly plagued by the desire to kill, which he began acting out on early. He would catch a fish, nail it to a board, and watch it wiggle until it died." Mason went on to say that Nathan resented his mother for ignoring the abuse. He also said that Nathan saw his father as Satan in a way, because Nathan at one point said he killed his father because he was a, quote, lonely dude. In another conversation, when describing his favorite book, Nathan said it was Paradise Lost, and that he sympathized with Satan because he was a, quote, lonely dude. Howard Beazle, with the prosecution, would argue that Nathan had the foresight to hide the gun he would use for the murder from his father, showing that he knew it was wrong to have it. J. Daniel Barna agreed that Nathan showed no signs of being mentally defective or ill. He said that Nathan had many warning signs of his behavior, including vandalism and petty crimes, and had a serious disregard for the rights of others. He said that Brooks had something more akin to a conduct disorder, and admitted to deliberately hurting his close friends from a young age. Barna also pointed out that Brooks had told him the whole, quote, satanic ritual aspect of the murders was just a ruse. He concluded with, quote, he is very, very, very dangerous. Barna said Brooks was, quote, a highly intelligent person who controls and intimidates others easily. Both psychologists working for the prosecution did point out that the test Brooks was given to help determine sanity was tailored for adults. And since Brooks was 17 at the time, the test may have not been accurate. They also pointed out that the disorders that Mason claimed Nathan had would point to someone who is extremely introverted, but Nathan could be very sociable and charming. They also said that Nathan could comprehend the wrongfulness of his actions, especially given that he said, quote, I shouldn't have done it, just hours after the murders. Public defender James Nicholson argued that Nathan was 17 and far from mentally sound. He said that Nathan had been making elaborate plans to sacrifice 30 people to Satan, though his list only contained 16 names, so Nathan's attorney was quoting the previously mentioned rumors that had already been debunked, and that he was out of control and didn't know how to stop. He stressed that planning sacrifices using animals or his own blood was not the behavior of a sane teenager. Nicholson also pointed out that Nathan had shown remorse afterward. In his statement when police caught up with him at the cemetery, he had said, quote, I shouldn't have done it. Also, despite previously planning on killing Ryan, he tried to leave money to help take care of his younger brother. In an attempt to garner sympathy, Nicholson had used the exact same argument the prosecution used to show Nathan did know the difference between right and wrong. One neurologist, Dr. Sirni Govindan, testified that Brooks had, quote, paranoid schizophrenia, delusions of grandeur, an obsessive-compulsive behavior disorder, hallucinations, including an olfactory aura sensation he described as the smell of rotting flesh, rotting meat, and roadkill. He went on to say that Nathan had, quote, an abnormal blood flow pattern in the brain and suffered migraine headaches throughout his life. Govindan also pointed out that Nathan had been knocked out before while playing football, which could have contributed to his issues. John Mason agreed with Govindan and said Nathan also suffered from antisocial personality disorder. Mason had a few conversations with Nathan during his stay at the detention center, and said that even after he'd undergone some degree of therapy, Nathan was still a danger to himself and the public. While incarcerated, a female friend had been visiting him who he may have had some kind of romantic relationship with. During one interview, Nathan told Mason that he may be in love with the girl, but also had given a lot of thought as to how he would murder her. He spent 20 minutes detailing how he would do it and said that apparently she would like it. This girl was present during the trial, but left in tears after hearing that. Nathan had also uttered the often quoted phrase, quote, I could wait to kill again, saying that he thought he was more than capable of biding his time and killing when the time was right. Mason also mentioned the end goal of Nathan's plan that night had been to commit suicide after his murder spree, and that he believed Satan would bring him back, and that he would be, quote, all-powerful. Barna and Beazle concluded that in their opinions, Nathan had been of sound mind during the killings, and that even if his household was abusive, it did not excuse his behavior. Beazle stated, quote, You can have headaches and the olfactory aura and still tell the difference between right and wrong. It's my opinion that while he may have a personality disorder, he did not have a severe mental disorder during the offense. And that had Nathan been 18 at the time of the killings, people would not hesitate to label him a psychopath or sociopath rather than mentally ill. On October 21st, 1996, Nathan Brooks was found guilty of the murders of his parents. He showed no emotion when Judge Knapp read the verdict. Knapp reassured the jurors, saying, quote, "We know it wasn't an easy task, but for whatever it's worth, the court agrees with your verdict." When the verdict was announced, both Ryan and Jamie bowed their heads, and the rest of the family took the news with stoicism. After Brooks was taken away, the family gathered and tears were shed. The girl who had been romantically involved with Brooks stayed behind in the courtroom after the family left. Prosecutor Frank Pierce told the waiting reporters that he felt he had been fighting a, quote, uphill battle in regards to the insanity defense, as the consensus in the media was that surely Brooks had to be insane to commit such a heinous crime. Pierce said, quote, "We are very pleased and gratified that the jury did the right thing in this case." Sheriff McCourt thanked the local Barnesville police for housing Brooks during his trial, and noted that security for him had been a strain on their budget. After one of Nathan's first court visits, when he still had his face covered going to and from court, the other inmates allegedly threatened him, one yelling, quote, "We already know what you look like." On October 24th, Nathan Brooks walked into court, escorted by 5 deputies and a police dog. He was given 2 life sentences with the possibility of parole after 43 years. Witnesses said he'd been joking around with the sheriffs around him and seemed uninterested in his sentencing. His aunt told Judge Knapp that, quote, "We love him and will always stand by him. I hope he doesn't fall through the cracks in prison." On October 31st, trick-or-treat was back in full force in the town of Bel Air, Ohio, but earlier than usual, from 6 to 7. This was because the parade was such a hit last year that people wanted the option to do both. The church and fire department banded together to host the event, with the fire department setting up a well-lit space so that people could see the costume contest better. Kids today in Bel Air still celebrate with Boo at the Park, but they don't know the dark history behind why the event started. When they get older, though, teenagers swap stories of Nathan Brooks on Halloween and scare each other with stories of satanic worship and murder, sometimes greatly exaggerated. In 2012, the Supreme Court ruled that juveniles could not be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Since Nathan was sentenced with the possibility of parole, this did not apply retroactively, and even in cases where juveniles are given life without parole, the ruling does not need to apply if state law overrules it. As of this year, Nathan Brooks is housed in the London, Ohio Correctional Facility and has spent 24 years in prison, well over half of his life. After his sentencing, he did appeal the verdict, but his public attorney did not cover appeals, and no coverage of this appeal made the mainstream news. Whether or not he really was suffering from schizophrenia or was simply attempting to manipulate the jury is unknown. In the 2 decades since, our understanding of mental illness has improved greatly, and perhaps a jury today would have turned a more sympathetic eye to someone whose brain was still developing at the time of the murders. Not only was Nathan a juvenile at the time, but recent studies have shown that the human brain is not fully developed until the age of 25. In regards to schizophrenia, not only has our ability to diagnose it gotten more precise, but antipsychotics are now so effective that once violent offenders can be released back into society after getting treatment. Then again, that's assuming Nathan was indeed suffering from schizophrenia, as he was described as smart, manipulative, and seemed to change his story depending on how it would benefit him the most. Like with any case where a child has committed murder, people have to wonder if justice is really being served by locking them up for life or close to it. It doesn't seem fair to take away the freedom of someone so young and make it so they essentially never see the light of day again. But the other argument to be made is that their victims will never get another chance at life, so why should they? Unlike the more recent cases of the Bever brothers or Josh Phillips, where a teenager close to adulthood committed murder, Nathan's case never made it back into the spotlight. Aside from the 2015 article, his case was largely forgotten in 1996, and whether he has tried to appeal it or gotten help for his mental illness is kept out of the public eye. If nothing changes, he will be eligible for parole in 2038, either as a dangerous offender ready to kill again, or as a 60-year-old man, given just a few short years out of prison to try and have some semblance of a life. Music is provided by Hexsystem. Major sources for this episode include the Times Leader, the Wheeling News Register, and the Columbus Dispatch. For a full list of sources or links to our contributors, please see our show notes. Follow us on Twitter or Instagram at CompulsionCast to stay up to date on our latest episodes and news. See you in 2 weeks.